The grave of the Countess Mircalla was opened. The features, though 150 years had passed since her funeral, were tinted with the warmth of life. Her eyes were open. The leaden coffin floated with blood. Welcome back to the Dark Archives. I am the chronicler. Tonight's entry is Carmilla, Part 3, the conclusion of Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novella. When we last closed the record, a young woman named Laura had watched General Spielsdorf lunge at Carmilla with a hatchet in the ruined Chapel of Karnstein, watched the beautiful face collapse into something ancient and savage, and watched her vanish. The general told Laura to leave the accursed ground immediately, and then, at the doorway through which Carmilla had entered and disappeared, a very strange old man walked in. He was carrying a plan of the chapel. He knew exactly where the tomb was. What follows is the reckoning. Le Fanu writes it with the precision of a man filing a report, cold, procedural, almost clinical. And that restraint is exactly what makes it devastating. He does not linger on the horror, he documents it. The Imperial Commission was present, the medical men signed their names. The thing in the coffin was exactly what they said it was, and the archive notes for the record that it uttered a piercing shriek when the stake was driven through its heart, in all respects such as might escape from a living person in the last agony. But Le Fanu does not end there, and this is what separates Carmilla from every imitator that came after. He ends with Laura, with the image that remains after the horror is officially concluded and filed, with the sound of a light step at the drawing-room door, and the cold understanding that some things, once let in, do not entirely leave. The archive recommends that you listen to this final entry in a room with good locks. The record concludes. Tonight's entry is Carmilla, Part 3, the conclusion of Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novella. When we last closed the record, a young woman named Laura had watched General Spielsdorf lunge at Carmilla with a hatchet in the ruined Chapel of Karnstein, watched the beautiful face collapse into something ancient and savage, and watched her vanish. The general told Laura to leave the accursed ground immediately, and then, at the doorway through which Carmilla had entered and disappeared, a very strange old man walked in. He was carrying a plan of the chapel. He knew exactly where the tomb was. My father led me from the chapel and collected the good priest from a house nearby, and I was glad of the support, being unspeakably fatigued when we reached home. But my relief was changed to dismay on discovering that there were no tidings of Carmilla. Of what had occurred in the ruined chapel, no explanation was offered to me, and it was clear this was a secret my father for the present determined to keep. That night, the arrangements were singular. 2 servants and Madame sat up in my room, while the priest and my father kept watch in the adjoining dressing room. The priest performed certain solemn rites, whose purport I did not understand. I saw all clearly a few days later, but this appearance of Carmilla was followed immediately by the discontinuance of my nightly sufferings. The thing that had been visiting me in the dark was gone, and gone with it, as if by the same mechanism, was a sweet peculiar languor, the dim thoughts of death, the sense of sinking, but I had come without knowing it to almost welcome. I had not understood how thoroughly it had possessed me until it was removed, and I was left feeling scraped clean and frightened at how far I had drifted. The next day, the formal proceedings took place in the Chapel of Karnstein. The grave of the Countess Mircalla was opened. My father and the general each recognized, in the face now disclosed to view, the guest who had so recently deceived them both. The features, though 150 years had passed since her funeral, were tinted with the warmth of life. Her eyes were open. No cadaverous smell exhaled from the coffin. The medical men attested that there was a faint but appreciable respiration and a corresponding action of the heart. The limbs were perfectly flexible, the flesh elastic. The leaden coffin floated with blood. To a depth of 7 inches, the body lay immersed. Here were all the admitted signs and proofs. The body was therefore raised in accordance with ancient practice, and a sharp stake driven through the heart of the vampire, who uttered a "Rah!" at the moment in all respects such as might escape from a living person in the last agony. Then the head was struck off, and a torrent of blood flowed from the severed neck. The body and head were placed on a pile of wood, reduced to ashes, and the ashes were thrown upon the river and borne away. That territory has never since been troubled by such a visitation.
I write all this, you suppose, with composure. Far from it. I cannot think of it without agitation. Nothing but the earnest desire so repeatedly expressed could have induced me to sit down to a task that has unstrung my nerves for months, and re-induced a shadow of the unspeakable horror which, years after my deliverance, continued to make my days and nights dreadful, and solitude insupportably terrific. Let me add a word or two about that quaint Baron Vordenburg, to whose curious learning we were indebted for the discovery of Mircalla's grave. He had taken up residence in Graz, living upon a mere pittance, all that remained of his family's once princely estates, devoting himself entirely to the investigation of the authenticated tradition of vampirism. He had, at his fingertips, all the great and obscure works upon the subject, and a voluminous digest of all the judicial cases, from which he had extracted a system of principles but appear to govern the condition of the vampire. The Baron explained certain matters that the archive finds worth recording precisely. The deadly pallor attributed to such revenants in common legend, he told us, is a mere melodramatic fiction. In the grave and in human society alike, they present the appearance of perfect health, as anyone who had spent an evening with Carmilla would readily confirm. The vampire is sustained by daily renewed slumber in the grave, and by its nightly consumption of living blood. It is, the Baron noted, prone to become fascinated with engrossing vehemence, resembling the passion of love, by particular persons. In pursuit of these, it will exercise inexhaustible patience and stratagem, and will never desist until it has drained the very life of its coveted victim. But it will, in these cases, husband and protract its murderous enjoyment with the refinement of an epicure, and heighten it by the gradual approaches of an artful courtship. In these cases, it seems to yearn for something like sympathy and consent. The archive observes that Carmilla asked for both, repeatedly, in language that only made sense once you understood what she was asking you to consent to. The Baron also revealed the remarkable history of the tomb's concealment. My father asked how he had discovered the exact position of the long-lost monument. The Baron's grotesque features puckered into a mysterious smile. He fumbled with his spectacle case. Then he said, "I have many journals and papers written by a remarkable man. In very early youth, he had been a passionate and favored lover of the beautiful Mircalla, Countess Karnstein. Her early death plunged him into inconsolable grief. In the course of his studies, he discovered what she had become, and conceived a horror of her remains being profaned by posthumous execution. He adopted the stratagem of a pretended removal of her remains and a real obliteration of her monument to protect her." The Baron paused. When age had stolen upon him, and from the veil of years he looked back on the scenes he was leaving, he considered in a different spirit what he had done, and a horror took possession of him. He made the tracings and notes which guided me to the very spot, and drew up a confession. Death prevented any further action on his part, and the hand of a remote descendant has, too late for many, directed the pursuit to the lair of the beast.
The Baron said one more thing that the archive will not omit. One sign of the vampire is the power of the hand. The slender hand of Mircalla closed like a vice of steel on the general's wrist when he raised the hatchet. But its power is not confined to its grasp. It leaves a numbness in the limb it seizes, which is slowly, if ever, recovered from. The general, who had been listening quietly, turned his wrist over in the lamplight and said nothing. The following spring, my father took me on a tour through Italy. We remained away for more than a year. It was long before the terror of recent events subsided, and longer still before I ceased to wake in the night from dreams I could not entirely recall. I recovered. I was fortunate. Others were not. At dusk hour, the image of Carmilla returns to memory with ambiguous alternations. Sometimes the playful, languid, beautiful girl who pressed my hand and kissed my cheek and whispered things I did not understand. Sometimes the writhing thing I glimpsed for a single moment in the ruined chapel. The beautiful face collapsed into something that had never been human at all. And often from a reverie, I have started suddenly, certain in the instant of waking, but I heard the light step of Carmilla at the drawing-room door. It does not open. She is not there. She is ash on the water, carried away and dissolved. I know this. I have read the report with the signatures of the commissioners in my father's desk. She is gone. And yet the sound of that step persists, delicate, unhurried, already inside the threshold of the mind. And I think Fanu understood when he gave his narrator these final sentences. But this is the most honest thing that can be said about survival. But what visited you leaves a shape behind, the exact shape of its absence, and that the shape is permanent. The record is complete, filed and sealed. Carmilla, by Sheridan Fanu. 3 parts, 1 case. The archive does not often find itself moved. But Fanu earned those final sentences, the light step at the drawing-room door, and I have noted them carefully. If you have witnessed this entry to its conclusion, subscribe to the Dark Archives. Every darkness deserves a record. Every record deserves a witness. The next document in the collection is instructive. I think you will find it considerably more difficult to set aside than the last 3 combined. Until next time, the archives remain open.